Is Monk Rowe, and we are filming in Manhattan for the Hamilton College Jazz Archive. I'm very pleased to have veteran trombonist Wayne Andre with me.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Pleased to be here and honored to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure to meet you, and I'm wondering what it's like in 2002 to be a full-time trombonist in New York City.
For me, not too bad because I have a good pension.
Okay.
But for younger players, it's a scuffle. Are you talking about the music business in general, or are you talking about the jazz music business?
You know, I'm talking about in general right now.
In general,
I think. Yeah.
I think I've never seen it worse.
Yeah.
And we've been killed for many years by synthetic music. And California, which does the majority of the movies, they don't do all of them, but they do probably 95% of the movies have kind of gotten away from synthetic music. You know what I mean by synthetic music, don't
Sure.
you? Yeah.
Yeah.
Music made by synthesizers. That music that doesn't breathe. I hate it.
Yeah, that's a good.
I mean, it has its, it has its place in a certain place, but it's like when I do a jazz gig or whatever with electric piano, the thing I don't like about it is the instrument never seems to breathe. You know, like I like to hear space in music.
Right. There's no silence at all.
Yeah. And there's no nuance either with particularly with volume. You know, you don't hear pianissimo, you don't hear forte, you just hear this one blaring sound all the time. You know, but. I mean, this is my observation, hearing of it. But to get back to the business, I think I'm playing as well today as I've ever played in my life. But I must be honest, the recording business in New York City and the theater business, that I wouldn't want to do a Broadway show anyways. But the thing is, most of it is geared towards younger musicians. As well it should be. I had my time, you know, and I think I'm capable and qualified to do a lot more, but I'm thinking a lot of younger leaders come in and they got their guys, so to speak, and the older leaders that I work for kind of drift off, and I might be still playing, but they're not still writing, so I sit home and I'm not working that much, quite frankly, at all. But I'm doing a lot of writing. Okay. I have my own band, and I'm enjoying life, you know.
Good.
I'm in a nice place, you know.
Yeah. Had you decided at a fairly early age that music was going to be your career?
Yes, I did, as a matter of fact. I can start at the beginning if you want. I don't want to get too lengthy with this. I can get lengthy, but I came home from public school, I think in the 4th or 5th grade, and they had passed out this piece of paper about taking up a instrument in a group thing and everything else. And I said to my dad, I says, I think maybe I'd like to do the trumpet or the drum, something like that, you know. I can't remember. I'm sure I showed a certain amount of enthusiasm, but my father loved music, so if I wasn't enthusiastic, he certainly was. And he said to me, trumpet players are a dime a dozen. Play the trombone. And I'll tell you, for the better part, not so much today, but for the better part of my career, he was right.
Yeah.
So my mother went down to a pawn shop in Hartford, Connecticut, and bought me a 25. You had a rental horn at the school, and then she went down to this pawn shop and bought me a $25 trombone at the pawn shop, and I had that for the longest time. And but I remember, it's interesting you say that because I had a teacher in Hartford, Connecticut who had been in Gene Cooper's band, Bill Culley, and I remember saying to him one time, he says, you know, Bill, I says, you know, I really love this, you know, you think I can make a living in it? He says, well, sure, you know, and of course I didn't know whether I could or not.
Yeah. What kind of music was played in your house when you were a kid?
Well, the first record my father brought home when we got a turntable was Ain't Nobody Here But Us Chickens by Louis Jordan. And I played the death out of that. I loved it. And then later, and my father loved Johann Strauss. He loved German waltzes and stuff like that, so he bought some of those records, and we heard some of that. And that's about as heavy as the classical music got in my house at that time. And then I kind of graduated. I graduated to Tommy Dorsey, and then to Woody Herman, Stan Kenton, Count Basie. Although I must be honest about it, one thing lacking in those days, for me at the age of 17, is I was listening to all these bands, and much to my regret today, I didn't go out of my way, or maybe even have the knowledge of going out of my way and hearing a lot of Duke Ellington. Maybe it wasn't that available in my record store. I don't remember, but I remember I was really into mostly Basie and Woody Herman, Stan Kenton, and some small Kay Winding, and
who you ended up working with.
Right?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I see you did some study at the Schillinger House.
Yeah.
I've seen that name come up a lot.
You see it come up a lot?
Yeah, I do.
Because not many people know the name.
Really?
But that's what it was called when I went there. It's now the Berklee School of Music.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting because my mother took me up to Boston at I was 17 years old, and I auditioned for this fellow, Ken McKillop, who was he was the assistant to Larry Burke, and they gave me full scholarship, and I can't remember the details. I had a full scholarship. I didn't pay any tuition based on my audition, I guess, and I don't know if that would have applied to the second, third, and fourth year of the school or not, but once I got out of the school the first year, I ended up going out on the road, and I never went back, I mean, that's one of those things.
That happens frequently with better players.
Well, I went with Charlie Spivak's band, and then, then I got into the Korean War, so I was in the service, that's why.
Pardon?
The Korean War,
yeah.
I was in the Air Force
Early
during the
50s,
Korean War. And so that took up like 3 years and 9 months of my time. I got out early by 3 months,
Did you do music in the service? Or
yeah. As a matter of fact, that's where I first started to write. I started writing in the service mainly through the small tools that I had learned at the Schillinger House. And they seem so simple today. But they were such invaluable tools, and then I would start copying a lot of records. Like I remember taking 4 others off the record, and how I would do it is I would figure out what the harmony is. Then I could hear if it was closed or open voicing, and I could hear that, and I could kind of hear the bottom and the top, but I couldn't hear everything in between. So I'd figure out the harmony, so I'd kind of put up the arrangement together, and whether I got the exact notes or not really doesn't matter as long as it sounded the same. Right. Like I think in 4 others, which I kind of like better. I'm blowing my own horn now. I think the second chord I use in 4 others, I use an E 7th chord, and I think Jimmy Jufa used a B flat half diminished.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, they're fairly close.
So, but it's fairly close. I mean, if you think about it, you know. Still has that dominant sound anyway. But that's how I learned how to write. And and a lot of my writing, and I think a lot of people's writing today is you learn by analysis. When I went to the Manhattan School of Music, I learned more about music in an analysis course than any place else, I think,
Yeah. It helps too to have people to play your stuff.
Oh yeah.
Fairly soon after
it's like having a baby. When I was in the service, I'd just finished writing and copying arrangement. When I had come down the next morning, we'd have jazz band, and I'd put it down and let's do it. You know what I'm saying?
Wow.
And I did a lot of writing in the service. I remember the warrant officer who was in charge of the band subsequently went on and became Colonel Gabriel, the head of all the Air Force bands in Washington. After I left, he went down to Washington. as I was getting out of the service, he tried to stop me from taking my arrangements.
Oh, yeah.
And I had to go above his head and say, this was not my CO. I mean, whatever you call it. This is, I forget what it was. This is not what I'm here as a trombone player. So if I did this writing, I did it on my own time. I didn't do it
I
on
see.
Air Force time, so it doesn't belong to the Air Force. So I ended up taking all my arrangements.
Wow.
He wanted to keep them because he had started a band or something,
Yeah.
and he wanted to keep all that music, you know.
Mm-hmm. Must have been pretty good then.
But I didn't have much money, and so I sat around the barracks and I was writing music, you know.
Yeah. Did you ever consider making a career out of the service?
No, no.
No, thank you, Ray.
I mean, Sammy Nestico did, and I think Sammy Nestico has had a fantastic life. He stayed in the service 20 years. He went in very young, and he came out and he just like blossomed, you know. And so 20 years lost, if you think of it as lost in the service for Sammy Nestico, we're really not lost. I mean, he had a good job in Washington and everything else. So, but
Well, tell
I
me
was
about,
no Sammy Nestico.
okay. Tell me about your first kind of road experience. Was it an eye opener, and were your parents like
Oh yeah,
into it?
What happened is I had been down to when I left the Schillinger house, this guy that was in the school wanted me to get a bunch of musicians together to go down to Myrtle Beach and play for the summer at this place down there, you know. So we went down to this place and we did some rehearsing and everything else. A lot of it was arrangements from a band we had in Hartford prior to me going to, how I knew I wanted to write music. Now we're getting a little off the track. When I was in high school, I got off the track here, but when I was in high school, I got called into the principal's office because I kept cutting my last period of study hall. And so I'd go into, and that wasn't every day, I think it was one day a week. And so I got called in front of the principal and the vice principal, Thomas Quirk and Mr. Allen, right? And never forget those names. I'll forget people's names I met yesterday.
Yeah.
But and they sat down over me. I said, I'm going over the Hartford School of Music, and I'm playing with this band of musicians that just got out of World War II that I'm learning a lot from. Names you don't know. The leader was a guy by the name of, very good arranger and trombone player, Chick Cicchetti from around Waterbury, Connecticut. And he just passed away a couple of years ago. But I said, this is what I want to do. This is what I'm learning. This is a learning thing for me over there. Instead of sitting in the study hall, they said, go for it. That's that thing.
Yeah.
Now, anyway, so we came back through New York after had been in Myrtle Beach for the summer, where the band leader and his guy walked out on the band and never paid us, and we had a...
There you go.
And my father had to send me money for a Greyhound bus, and I stopped off at his friend's house in New York, and I stayed here for a while with him. He lived in the village with his parents, who treated me just marvelous. And I went and auditioned for Charlie Spivak's band, and I got the job. So I went out on the road with Charlie Spivak's band. Now, this is 1950, I guess. Yeah. I got out of high school in June of '49, went to Boston September of '49. Yeah, I guess it was, it was in 50. And I went out on the road with Spivak's band, and matter of fact, a very famous vocalist was on that band. A famous, maybe not big famous, but you may not know her name, Lynn Roberts. She was on that band, and I think I was 17, and she was like 15, and everybody thought she was 18. I'm serious.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm serious. And she went on to sing with Tommy Dorsey, and she became pretty well known. And we finally met after many years back in the New York studio scene, where she would become a jingle singer.
What kind of money were you making?
I was making, with Charlie Spivak, I was making $100 a week. And I had to pay for my own hotel room. But the hotel rooms were, for the most part, anywhere between $2 and $4 a night. You always room with somebody else.
Yeah.
I mean, you didn't have your own room. And maybe the room was like $8, $6, something like that. Never over 10. And and a lot of times with those bands, what you'd do is you'd finish a job at 1 o'clock in the morning, and you'd drive all night to the next place, and you'd check in like at 8 o'clock in the morning, and you'd get 2 nights for one.
Oh, yeah.
You'd
I've
sleep
heard-
all day and then sleep all night for one fee, you know, providing the room was ready.
Right.
So well, it was, I was first time away from home. It was a big eye opener. I mean, houses of prostitution in Athens, Georgia, and I was a young kid, and the whole band takes me to this place.
Really? Here's your education.
Athens, Georgia. I'll never forget it.
Wow.
And you go in this room, and all these women were sitting around the wall. Those vivid pictures you
Wow.
never forget.
Just like point.
Actually, you did.
Yeah.
You did. You decided which one you wanted. It was my first experience with any prostitute, I think, needless to say, they got my money and I failed. Anyways, I was on that band, I don't know, maybe. Just before I went into I left to go into the Korean War. I got drafted to go into the Korean War, so
Yeah.
I left, and I was on the band probably a year at the most.
Yeah.
If not
Mostly
even that.
dances and.
Oh yeah,
thing. Yeah.
bands in those days were playing public dances, which you don't see anymore. In a ballroom in Indiana or something like that. That was all the bands went through. Lake Compounds, Connecticut, all the bands went through, and you'd play at officers' club and NCO clubs in the service, and you'd. Big thing too, bands did in those days. I remember that with this band. Is you'd go into a college and you would play a dance on Friday night, a concert Saturday afternoon, and a dance Saturday night. So that was like a long weekend in a college, and colleges used to hire bands that way. As a matter of fact, Kay Whitney got wised up. Kay Whitney was a very good businessman. He decided he was going to take his trombone band and compete with the big bands. So he started getting a lot of that work after he decided he didn't want to play the jazz clubs anymore. So we were jumping around playing these colleges, not all over the country, but from here to the Mississippi River. Generally, that's most of the business was. One time with Spivak, we ended up in Texas, I remember, for like, and everything was done with a bus.
Yeah.
Not with Kate Winding, but with Charlie Spivak was a bus. And anyways, I came out of the service, and I could talk for a long, long time, and like experience on Charlie Spivak's band, how I learned, I was young, and I grew up with Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker and everything else. Most of the guys in the band were a little older than that, right?
Yeah.
So when I did I took Leon Cox's place, as a matter of fact. I don't know if you know that name.
Yeah.
But he's the guy that played the very, very famous trombone solo on Gene Krupa's record of Lover. It's a very unusual solo. And so I got, when I moved up to third trombone or second trombone when he left, I never did play first trombone in that band. I learned a lot from Vinnie Forchetti, who was playing first trombone in that band for the last part of the time I was on it. I learned a lot from him. But I had one guy in back of me who loved me dearly. He's kind of a jokester. His name is Buddy Yannon and everything else, and he played kind of like Sweets Edison, and stuff like that. And but he yelled down at me, he says, "Stop playing that Chinese music." I was hearing things bebop, wild, and although I knew very little about harmony, I was doing everything by ear and everything else. That's what was coming out. That was my roots, you see, and
Isn't that what Cab told Dizzy? Stop playing that Chinese
Yeah,
music.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I do have opinions about that. I think if you're playing in a Dixieland band, you don't play bebop. Some people feel they play the way they play no matter what they're playing. You know, I think you have to try to kind of play. Maybe you're prostituting yourself. I don't think so. I think you have to kind of play in the style of the music you're playing in. You know, you can't get. But I kind of learned that as I got older. You know. I think I can play in a Dixieland band, and I think I can play creative in a simpler harmonic way and still be creative and be happy with myself, you know, and naturally I'd rather play with music that's a little more modern harmonically, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, you were in the Sauter Finnegan band, which was really kind of different from most.
Well, that certainly was a huge learning experience for me. I mean, I had just come out of the service, and I auditioned in the same studio, NOLA Studios, not the NOLA Studios that exist now in New York, but it was a new rehearsal studio, famous rehearsal studio on Broadway, around 52nd Street, I think it was. And in the same studio I rehearsed, I went up and took an audition for the Sauter Finnegan band. They were looking for a trombone player, and I got the job. And I remember, I'll never forget, Eddie Sauter coming around with a questionnaire to everybody before they got up to sit in and play with the band, like, what kind of music do you like and who do you like musically, you know? And I remember distinctly putting down Irby Green, who was my idol, and probably Dizzy Gillespie for sure, and most likely Charlie Parker, you know, and I got the job. But and I had played the jazz chair on the Sauter Finnegan band. You know, what jazz there was to play, I got to do that, and they liked me, and it was a wonderful time. I mean, I could go on and talk and talk and talk, but the thing is, what made me leave the Sauter Finnegan band, and I did quit, was I got an offer to go play first trombone with Woody Herman's band. And I had never had the opportunity to play first trombone, except for in the Air Force. I did, certainly. And so the money was actually less. I think Sauter Finnegan was paying $150 a week at this time, and Woody Herman was paying $125 a week. No, I was making $150 with Woody Herman. I think the money was about the same, to tell you the truth. But money, it didn't make that much money to make that much difference, you know. And Kay Finnegan, Bill Finnegan's wife, was extremely insulted when I left the band.
Oh, really?
She says, "You're going to leave us to go with that band?" And I can understand, because she had such a love for her husband and such a passion for their music, and their music was great. Everything was great. It was great. But the thing I didn't like about it is there was no freedom. Except when you had a jazz solo, which wasn't that often, but all the nuances were written in, and you had to play them exactly as written. You couldn't take any liberty with the crescendo, and it was either vibrato or no vibrato, or it was like playing in a symphony orchestra.
I was just going to say, very classical.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It wasn't classical music, but the thing is, they approached it like an orchestra, and you had to play like you were in an orchestra. And Woody Herman, I've always fantasized about Woody Herman's band, so I had this opportunity to play. So I'll never forget. And I joined Woody Herman's band. It was on New Year's Eve. December 31st, 1955, or the beginning of 56. And we played this TV show in Philadelphia, live TV show. We were on the air about a solid hour or something like that. And I don't think it was network TV, but anyways, I'm playing first trombone, sight reading.
On the television.
Cy Tuff was playing second trombone, And I mean, but he played the bass trumpet.
Bass trumpet, yeah.
You know, and he wasn't strong enough sound-wise to play lead. And Bobby Lamb was playing third trombone, who was a very good trombone player, but he was kind of green then. I think he was kind of green then. He's a very good trombone player. He's matured. I don't know if you know the name Bobby Lamb.
No.
He's a very good trombone player. He lives in England. But Bobby would get so drunk that the cops couldn't understand him when they'd pick him up in the street, so they'd put him in jail because they couldn't understand his English. He was like had this thick Irish brogue, you know. One time he landed in jail in Atlanta because the cops couldn't understand him. Anyways, so I played first trombone. That was the trombone section. Side tough, Bobby Lamb and myself. And then that first night, Woody calls up 4 others. Now, 4 others is written for 4 trombones. We only had 3 trombones. But they play it to this day, I think. I don't know if they play it anymore, but in those days they played it with one of the tenor saxophone players playing one of the trombone parts.
Oh. Uh-huh.
Which plays an inside part. It works, you know. So I did this thing, and I was like sweating bullets, you know. So after the show, Woody came over to me and said, "Man," he said, "that was the greatest piece of sight reading I've ever witnessed." He says, "That was terrific." And I said, "Well, I wasn't sight reading, Woody." I said, "I'd heard that record so many times that I knew what was coming."
Yeah.
You know, I'd listened to the
Right.
record, and when you know what's coming, you're not really reading, you know.
Right.
You know. So, so then I was on Woody's band to pretty much up until June or July of '56, and sometime around March or April, Bill Harris came back to the band, and he came back to the band playing second trombone. I guess he was just getting back into playing. He was getting his chops together and everything else. But Bill was one of the most incredible trombone players that I've ever experienced in my life. I mean, this guy was the epitome of a great jazz trombone player. But he couldn't play second trombone. He couldn't do anything the way I did it. You know?
Yeah, right.
You know what I mean?
Right. He was not a follower.
And it wasn't anything personal, you know. So I finally went to Woody, because Bill had always played first trombone in that band,
Yeah.
you know. I finally went to Woody. I said, "You know, Bill, Woody, maybe it'd be better for the band if Bill plays first trombone and I follow him." Well, it worked, and it was great, except for those new pieces that Bill didn't know.
Oh.
And then it was a problem with his time, because, and he had wonderful time, but by the time the thing went from here to here to here, it came out late because he was an admittedly bad reader. So if he was reading something he knew, it was like on the money.
Yeah.
But if he was sight reading something, it was like, anyways. And Bill was the one that said to me, "Wayne," when I left the band, and Bill Harris, without telling me this, because Kay Winding and J.J. Johnson were around the corner in Philadelphia. When we were working at Pep's, they were around the corner. I forget the name of that club there. And I didn't know Kay, but Bill certainly did, you know. And it was Bill that recommended me to Kay for his group. So that's when Kay called me. That's when I left Woody's band. And Woody and Bill Harris said to me, he said, "Wayne," he said, "the way you read and everything else, whatever you do, don't stay out here. Go to New York and go in the studios, because that's where you're going to make the money." And
And you took that
and he
advice
hadn't been
eventually.
successful at it. He had been, matter of fact, he's on some of those sort of Finnegan studio recordings, Bill Harris, because he was around New York. But he hadn't been successful at the studio thing only because of his reading
Yeah.
and his individuality too. You know, he couldn't play like Tommy Dorsey. He could only play like Bill Harris, you know.
Yeah.
And back in the days in studios, when you first came to New York in studios and you had to play any kind of written solo, it really had to be in the tradition of Tommy Dorsey.
Oh.
You know.
Yeah. So you.
All right,
passed-
thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
You did some arranging for the trombone group with Kay. And how many trombones was that?
Thanks to Bill Harris.
Yeah.
Bill said, "Kay's going to do a record." He says, "Sit down and write an original piece of music." And Bill said, "Okay." And Bill said, "Sit down and write an original piece of music." And Kay said, "Okay." And Bill said, "Sit down and write an original piece of music." And Kay said, "Okay." And Bill said, "Sit down and write an original piece of music." And I did, and it was the first original piece, not the first original piece, I shouldn't say I did some in the service, but I didn't do a whole lot of original pieces. But I wrote this piece called, I named it Nutcracker. And I only named it Nutcracker, I don't know what made me name it Nutcracker, because Connecticut is a nutmeg state, I think, isn't it? I think Connecticut is a nutmeg state.
Really?
And whether I had Connecticut on my mind, or whether when I was writing this piece, I thought this might be a ball buster to play, and I called it Nutcracker. I don't really know why
So,
I called it
wasn't after
Nutcracker, but I
Tchaikovsky.
called it Nutcracker anyways. And Kay liked it, recorded on the first record. As a matter of fact, he liked it so much that it was, when we finished doing the album, and I don't have the videotape of this, but I have the audio tape. We finished doing the album. Before we went on the road, we were on the Steve Allen Show, which was the Tonight Show then.
Yeah.
And we did 2 tunes, Nutcracker, and the thing we did with the tromboniums, from Carousel,
No,
Little
not-
Girl,
Oh,
the tune from Carousel.
okay.
And we were, because Steve Allen made mention we were going to this club in Philadelphia, back to this club, Philadelphia, called Peps, where I had been with Woody Herman, where
Yeah.
it was an active club in Philadelphia in those days. And I did that, and I did some more things. I think the things that I did that were recorded. I did The Preacher, which was a simple arrangement. It wasn't a copy of Horace Silver's arrangement, but it certainly had Horace Silver's inspiration behind it, you know. But it wasn't a copy of Horace Silver's arrangement, you know. Especially there was a shout chorus and everything else, and that's totally different from Horace Silver's arrangement. But I love that record of Horace Silver's, The Preacher, so I did that. And then I did some other things. I can't quite remember what they were. But then we started playing jazz. We were playing jazz club pretty much exclusively. We'd go to a place and be there a week or two or something like that. I remember we went to this place in Porky's Hideaway in Florida. We were there for like a month, just playing jazz music, you know. And then I don't know if it was before Carl left or not, but Kay decided that he wanted to make more money. So that's when I started doing a lot of writing, Dick Lieb and myself, of just standard tunes. He wanted a lot of tunes to go in and play dances.
Okay.
So they're just like, you know, any tune, I don't know, and just harmonize it, and you know, and then go on to another tune. It was no fancy arrangement. It was just
Right.
a tune. And I think Carl doesn't like to stay with one thing too long, anyways, no matter what it is, you know. But I think Carl left around this time, and that's when Don Sebesky came on. And Don Sebesky came on the group. I remember it was in the summertime, because Don was out of school. He went to the Manhattan School of Music, and he came on the group for the summertime. And Don was the one that told me, he says, Wayne, he says, you should go to school. You should go to the Manhattan School of Music. You know, I don't know if he said to him, but that's where he was going anyway. And he went back, I think, to school in September and left. And this trombone player, very good trombone player from Cincinnati, came on, took his place, called Ola Hansen. And no, he's from Columbus. And then it was while Ola was on the band that I left the group to settle in New York. It was in February of '58. I came in for the second semester of school because I was on the verge. I'm a depression baby, you know, so
Yeah.
I was going to lose my GI Bill if I didn't get into school in time, so I wasn't going to lose that money, so I decided I better get into school, you know. So I got in school, and the government paid all my education at the
Excellent.
Manhattan School of Music, and I stayed there, and I graduated in 1962, and that's, I was around town. Yeah, I think I graduated like, I'd taken some kind of exam, and what knowledge I'd learned at Berkeley helped me. I think I skipped a grade or something. I think I only went to
Okay.
Manhattan School of Music and got a degree in about 3 years' time. I think I went to summer school a bit too.
Right.
And so then I went to, then I was around town. I got the job at CBS. I was doing the Jackie Gleason show and everything else. Then the next thing that comes, and then it was Jerry Mulligan's concert jazz band. And then a big, not turning point, but the big thing that happened is when I was asked to go to Russia with Betty Goodman's band
Yeah.
in 1962.
That must have been an experience. Who else was that? Flip Phillips
No.
on that trip?
No,
This was,
no, it was
just a big band.
Zoot Sims,
okay.
Tommy Newsom. I think Gene Allen was playing baritone. Phil Woods and Jerry Dodgen was playing second alto. Trombones were Jimmy Knepper, Willie Dennis, and myself. Trumpets were Jimmy Maxwell, Joe Newman, Joe Wilder, and Johnny Frost. And the rhythm section was Mel Lewis. Bass was Bill Crow, and the piano was John Bunch. And the other piano player, who unfortunately didn't get to play very much,
Mm-hmm.
Teddy Wilson. Can you
Oh,
believe
jeez.
that? He didn't get to play. Benny wouldn't let him play, you know. After about a week, he decided that he wanted to use John and everything. Teddy, was brought along really to play with his trio. But anyways, we don't
Yeah.
go there. Oh, and Turk Van Lake was playing guitar, right. And we had this woman singer, Joya Sherrill, who had been with Duke Ellington's band. That was the
Oh,
whole
yeah,
band.
Joya Sherrill. Well, is he? Does he live up to his reputation? Did he live up to his reputation on that trip?
Who? Benny?
Benny?
Oh, I don't know how far you want me to go. Have you ever read Bill Crow's?
Yeah, some of
yeah.
it.
Well, I think pretty much Bill Crow, whatever Bill Crow said, would hit right on the head. The only thing I don't think it was deliberate. I always felt that should have come out before Benny died. But it, I mean, maybe it didn't just work out time-wise that way. I think Benny should have had an opportunity to read it.
Ah,
You know, I remember it coming out shortly after Benny died.
yeah.
Yeah, Benny was not a chameleon. He was not a jive ass. What you saw is what you got. What you saw, you didn't like a lot of times.
Mm-hmm.
Because he could be snaky, and he could be. I remember we were in Sochi in the Black Sea, and we had been in Moscow for a week, and we finally got to Sochi where the sun was and all the girls on the beach, and he calls a rehearsal like at 12 noon, and we're rehearsing. I think without exaggeration, he stood over Phil Woods in the saxophone section, but primarily over Phil Woods for almost an hour rehearsing the first chord of Let's Dance.
Oh,
And he finally turned down, looked at Phil, and he said, "You're supposed to learn how to do that in high school." So then we go back to the hotel that night. We had a big party. I don't know whose room was in. We were drinking a lot of vodka and everything. I remember Phil going out on the porch and can I use the
sure you
the F word?
can. Sure you can.
Go out on the porch. Fuck the king.
Yeah.
And that was in Sochi, and it was. I don't know. I hate to talk. I can tell you, I don't want to. There's some real dark things I could say that I don't want to go to,
Yeah, I know.
because it's not that I have never said them to anybody, but I don't know if I want to say it on tape.
Yeah. Well, I know he didn't make a lot of friends on that trip. I've talked to some other guys who were on that tour. And
Well, yeah, I don't think there's anybody in the band that was certainly, ironically, if anybody in that band, and I'm thinking about everybody in the band now, if anybody had something nice to say about Benny, and not dark and negative, it was Teddy Wilson. Teddy Wilson wasn't getting to play at all, and hardly at all, and he was as mild and mannered. He was a gentleman. I mean, this is like, Teddy Wilson was a first-class cat, man, you know. And I don't know. There's certain things that could have been better on the part of the musicians themselves. It became like, in a way, it became a little bit like a revolution going on too, you know. Mm-hmm. Well, let's start the ball going, okay? First of all, I wasn't initially supposed to go at all. Jimmy Knepper got the mumps, and he couldn't go to the World's Fair in Seattle. That was the first gig first, because of the mumps. And so Benny called Lou Shuby, who was the contractor at CBS, and find out if I could get a break from the Gary Moore show. And Shuby said, no, I couldn't go. Or maybe he called me and I asked. I can't remember all that. So Benny, it's a feather in my cap, I guess, but this is what was told to me. But it was told me by the contractor at CBS, not by Benny, that Benny went to Paley, William Paley. He went to the CEO.
Whoa.
And said, I want this guy, and tell the contractor to let him go, you know. So, I mean, it makes me feel good that somebody wanted me that much to go through all that trouble, you know. And so that made me feel good. So it's from that standpoint, it's hard to badmouth someone that you know. Anyways, but anyway, so I went, and some kid that was playing third trombone, he was a teacher out, and I don't know how he got hooked up with the Benny thing and everything else, but we went out to Seattle and the World's Fair and everything else. We came back to New York, and Jimmy Knepper rejoined the band, and this kid left. Instead of me going, this kid left. I stayed on the band. So, I forget, what was there was a question relating to this. Was there, I can't remember.
Well, I just said he didn't seem to make any friends on that particular tour.
Yeah.
You know, I've heard.
Oh, I know what it is. So he had told me over the phone. I didn't have anything written. Nothing written. He told me over the phone he'd pay me $500 a week. And back in those days, that was 62. That was a good sum of money, you know. So I certainly said yes. Obviously, I go to get my first paycheck, and it's $400. And the reason it's $400 is because, I don't know if Benny told me this himself. I can't remember if her secretary, Muriel Zuckerman, told me. I'm not sure, but it came from him anyways. He said $500 because he thought I was going to have to pay for my hotel. And now that I didn't have to pay for my hotel, he was going to pay me $400. Well, he knew. He knew that we weren't going to have to pay for a hotel room. But see, the old style of band musicians, the Charlie Spivak, the Tommy Dorseys, and all that, back in those days, before 1962, the musicians always paid for their own hotel. You got a salary, you pay for your hotel. So that was kind of dirty pool, you know. And I can't remember, to tell you the truth, to be honest about it, I can't remember if he pulled this on other people, but right away you got off on a bad foot. And then, so Jimmy Knepper's playing first trombone and doing a good job of playing first trombone, and all of a sudden, Benny doesn't want him to play first trombone, he wants me to play first trombone. So all of a sudden, so Jimmy Knepper's playing third trombone. And, Jimmy didn't show me any hostility, or it wasn't my doings or anything else like that. But he played games like that with musicians. He kind of pitted musicians one against one another. He created the dissension himself in the band. And I think a lot of it, sometimes you wonder about it, if everybody was put on edge so much, so that he would sound better. I don't know.
Could be.
Well, I don't know. I mean, people that were there hearing this or seeing this might disagree with me, but that's sometimes the way I felt about
Well,
it,
didn't he sometimes take solos away from people if they were getting too much recognition.
Oh, definitely. I mean, Joya Sherrill. Well, now I'll tell you a true story. Joya Sherrill is a lovely looking woman, a good vocalist, had good credit, sang with Duke Ellington and everything else. A wonderful person. I mean, and the Russians loved her. And she was coming out, and she was doing like 3 or 4 songs a concert. And he kept cutting her down. By the end of the tour, she was doing 1 tune a concert. Well, that's an insult to a vocalist, to come out and do 1 tune
Yeah.
on a whole concert, 1 tune. You know, at least 2. But I mean, she started out doing 4 or 5, now she's down to 1, you know.
Yeah.
So it was obvious Benny didn't like the idea that she was getting so much love from the audience. You know, she was. So when we get to the airport in Paris on the way home, we were all splitting up. I was staying in Paris with John Bunch, and most of the guys were going home. And Benny was going to the Swiss bank in Zurich. And we were all splitting up. So Joya goes over to Benny. This is something. Joya goes over to Benny and taps him on the shoulder, and she says, "I was standing right there." He says, I think you picked up my camera by mistake." And turns around, looks at the camera, he says, "Oh yeah." He drops it on the floor.
Oh,
I mean, he didn't break it.
yeah.
I won't say he broke it. But the point is, he didn't hand it to her. He just dropped it on the floor and walked away. Another famous story that's been told 40,000 times about the rehearsal. I think the true story of this is that it was Lynn Roberts, the singer that was singing with Benny. This was before this, when they were rehearsing up his house in Connecticut, in his back barn or wherever he used to rehearse. You heard that story?
It was so cold or
Yeah,
something?
it's so cold. And she says, "Benny, it's getting cold in here." So he says, "Oh yeah." So he goes in and puts a jacket down and comes back out. But anyway, that's kind of
yeah.
eccentric story.
Well, I know one trumpet player that was on that tour who will not say the name Benny Goodman. He was so upset at how that tour went that he'll say,
Well, that's obviously Joe Wilder.
yeah, he'll say the clarinet player.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, he treated Joe really badly. His reason for treating Joe badly was that Benny has this crazy way of thinking that somebody's using him. And Joe had a lot of excess luggage due to the fact that he was going from Russia to Sweden to meet his wife, because she's Swedish, and he wasn't coming home. So he had all this luggage he was carrying around, or something. I'm not quite sure
Yeah,
of my
plus
facts
his
here. But
cameras,
there was some hostility
Yeah.
over this, and
Yeah.
Benny was kind of rubbing him, like, trying to not deduct money from his pay for overweight luggage and all kinds of stuff. And it was so dumb because the government was paying it all. The United States government was paying this thing. It was a State Department tour. It wasn't
It wasn't coming out
a
of Benny's
free
pocket.
enterprise
Yeah.
thing
Yeah.
sponsored by Benny Goodman or a producer or something, And I've never heard Joe Wilder in my life swear, but I heard him swear behind me on that trip. Not anything really profane, but
Yeah. For Joe.
But Joe was sitting right in back of me,
Yeah.
And yeah, well,
Yeah. Enough said, I guess.
I mean, there's other stories I could tell you that I don't. It was so dark. I don't even want to go there.
Yeah. Well, let me talk about the studio scene that you had a big part in, and I was curious about the racial makeup of the studio bands at the time, and did it change, and is it still changing from what
It
you see?
changed drastically. When I first came into New York, the studio musicians, the studio bands, there was no set studio band. It was just a bunch of freelance players that were hired for different sessions, et cetera, were very integrated.
This was what year then?
I came to New York in February of '62. and I got kind of active in the studio work. It wasn't very long after that, maybe 63. Took me
Okay.
about a year to get ingrained in the thing. And the rhythm section in those days, the first call rhythm section was Mill Hinton, O.C. Johnson, and Hank Jones. I mean, I'm not saying they did everything, but that was pretty much the rhythm section. But in those days, everything in the studios, whether it be a jingle or a recording, all was based on swing music. I mean, the only time you'd play a straight eighth note is if you did something was like a cha-cha on a commercial record, or like something like a cha-cha or something like that.
Yeah.
You know, this is before rock and roll. And when rock and roll started coming in, except for some drummers, and of course there was some exceptions like John Faddis, the studio bands became more white. There were more white musicians in the ratio to black musicians, you know. I don't know why that was. I don't know that was. There was one thing in studio music, I must admit, and I'm not saying that I'm not trying to say here, and I hope it's not misconstrued, that, and I'm not looking to say this was the reason, but there was a time in studio music where you'd be playing rock and roll, but you'd be playing swing kind of rhythmentation, like Blood, Sweat, and Tears. Let's say Blood, Sweat, and Tears. But it's all written in 16 notes. Now, and there was a long period in the studios where everything was done in 16th notes instead of 8th notes.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Oh, sure. Da-da-da, which is 8th quarter, 8th, all of a sudden became da-da-da, 16th, 8th, 16th. So if you get a very complicated rhythmic figure that wasn't really that complicated, but it was all in 16th notes, it was a little harder to decipher. And the people that deciphered it faster and didn't have to think about it much were obviously the people that were noticed and worked more. Now, I don't know if I don't know what to say about it, and I'm not saying that was the reason that there was more white musicians doing that work. I mean, it may have something to do, and I hope it's not misconstrued. It may have something to do with the education.
Yeah. Perhaps
know.
more of the white players
You know.
went through the college.
You know, and went through the college, or the way that having been exposed more to urban studies, or what I don't know. I don't know what to say. You know, but that was one thing. But I noticed, generally speaking, in my last years in playing studio music, that the musicians weren't as integrated as in proportion, ratios, that it had been in the past.
It's interesting because it seems like it kind of went in a circle then, because before Milt Hinton and those fellas, it's my understanding that the studio musicians were almost exclusively white players.
That's true. That's before my time.
Right. And so then when you got in it, it was more integrated,
Yeah.
and then it went back
Yeah.
the other way.
Yeah, I think you're talking about you know, what you're talking about is the Tommy Dorsey era, the fallout of the Paul Whiteman band. That the thing, you know.
I'm not sure.
Paul Whiteman was a white band,
Yeah.
you know, and king of jazz and all this stuff, and we know he wasn't, of course, but a lot of those musicians were ended up being premier studio musicians in the thing. Jimmy Dorsey, Tommy Dorsey, Harry Klein, and you're right. I didn't think about that, but it's
Yeah.
true. And anyways,
Well, you're writing You say you're doing an awful lot more writing now.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, Bill
great.
Walters called me just last night. My wife answered the phone and says, my wife asked, who is it? She says, tell Wayne it's God.
Sounds like him.
So he calls me quite often, but he had just picked up this new ITA journal where I'd gotten a really good review from the brass conference.
Mm-hmm.
Bill Spilka did this article, and he said that my band and we followed the 1 o'clock North
Wow.
Texas band. We followed them. And Bill Spilka said, this band that Wayne Andre got together and the music, I haven't seen the article, Bill was reading it to me, is the best thing that happened at the brass conference.
Right. Right. Excellent.
I think what part of it was, when I went up on stage after the North Texas band breaking down, I told them, I said, I don't want all these microphones. Get rid of all these microphones. I can't stand that sound.
Isn't that something?
I can't stand that. Everybody's got to have a mic. I can't stand it. The music is written so that it'll sound okay without the microphones,
Yeah.
you know. If you got a flute solo and it's overly orchestrated and you can't hear the flute, it's your fault, you know. I mean, recording session is different.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're writing live music, you got to write live music that acoustically sounds right, you know, and you
Yeah.
learn that.
And let the players balance, you know.
I did a concert. I'll never forget this. I did a concert. I had a big solo in the concert. I did a concert with Tony Bennett at Carnegie Hall. And on the first half of the concert was Robert Farnham and his music.
Orchestra.
And we were doing the music from Porgy and Beth.
Mm-hmm.
And I just have to tell you the story how I ended up getting this solo, because Buddy Marr was actually the first trombone player, but this thing, Buddy came across it, you know, Buddy's a wonderful, wonderful cat, but this thing, for some reason, came across, was written in the alto clef or some damn
Uh-huh.
thing like that, and it was a spooky solo, because the whole band stopped, and you go, now listen carefully, da 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 dee da dee da 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 da. You modulate right at the top. You don't da 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 dee dee da 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 da. You modulate da 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 dee da da dee da dee dee da 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 da, and it modulates right away. And it was something that's beautiful, but you kind of had to either hear it or read it. And so Buddy said, "Man," he said, "why don't you play this thing?" So that's how I ended up getting the solo, you know.
Yeah.
And after the rehearsal, I saw all these microphones. I went up to Robert Farm. I didn't know Robert Farm at all. I said, Robert, I said, you know, this is Carnegie Hall. This music is so beautifully orchestrated. All these microphones are gonna ruin the music. He said, oh no, we don't need any microphones. What are you talking about, microphones? So because of me, all the microphones, I don't know if they were taken down, but they were shut off.
Yeah.
And that concert, you know,
Yeah.
that concert was a big success concert. I'm not saying I was the reason it was a big success, but
Right.
I'm just saying that
Yeah.
I hate music that sounds like over. Anyways, the North Texas band.
Right.
That, I said, you know, I don't want any microphone. We'll have one microphone solo for a trumpet solo,
Yeah.
or just maybe a couple, 2 or 3 solo mics, and that's all we need, you know.
Yeah.
And my music that I write and I played in that concert, by and large, I have to be careful. I don't give myself too many accolades, but most of it, each piece is different. You know, each piece is different, and the first piece doesn't sound like the fourth piece. You know.
Yeah.
Like I did this real production number that came out really terrific on My Man's Gone Now, and that was kind of maybe the highlight of the concert. But then we ended up doing the thing I wrote for Doc Severinsen, which actually Bill Waters recorded with Danny Stiles, that piece Ayo, that kind of ended the concert. And but the thing is, I haven't heard a lot of college bands, but that night with the North Texas band, and it's a great band. it's always in fifth gear. The energy.
It's like
It's
getting beat
it's
up
gotta
on
be
the head.
like this all the time.
Yeah.
It's just like, it's just like, give me a break.
Yeah.
And it's good, but the energy level is constant.
Yeah.
It's not.
So it probably, when your group came on, it was like everybody's ears were able
Yeah.
to relax
Yeah.
and really listen.
And plus, it was
not-
more acoustic. It was more acoustic sounding because the microphones were taken away.
Right.
And
Well-
I think that had a lot to do with the article that Bill Spilker wrote in J Journal.
Let me play a couple little excerpts of albums you've played on. Some of which are really my favorites. You recall this?
The Accidentals. The Accidentals?
No. See, this is like a personal blindfold test. It's a Don Sebesky date. Well, I'll just have to tell you. This is Jackie and Roy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I remember. Yeah.
Yeah. Really a great sounding record.
Oh, I know it.
Yeah.
I mean, Don is a master.
Uh-huh.
Don is a master. I mean, have you interviewed him yet?
No, I'm working on it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
He's a master. I mean, he's just. I thank Don a lot because, well, he was actually. I learned more about music from this one teacher at the Manhattan School of Music than anybody ever learned in my life, except for great players I sat next to, like Brookmeyer and people like that. But I have to thank Don because he was the guy told me to go back to school. And I went back to school because he thought it was the thing to do, and that's what
Yeah.
I did.
Yeah.
And I studied with this one teacher, Yolanda Ulela. Ulela is her last name. She taught composition and at the Manhattan School of Music. And I wasn't a composition major. Much to my regret, today I wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that when I went back to school, I felt that I was going to be busy playing the trombone, and to be a composition major takes a lot of time and work. And I felt it was going to take me too far away from my trombone,
Mm-hmm.
You have to put a lot of time into, And Don was a composition major, but
Well, let me try this one on you. I don't think the brass is in right away, but
there's the trombones. Yeah.
I think it's
That's the
funny.
saxophone player to play with Dave Brubeck.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's Paul Desmond.
Paul Desmond, right, yeah. Yeah, I remember doing that, yeah.
Yeah. And then here's one more.
Jocko.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll never forget that band.
I'll bet. Was that a scene or what? A different kind of Benny Goodman scene?
No, it was totally different. I mean, there was a lot of love
Yeah.
between the musicians in that band. There was a lot of
Good.
camaraderie. Benny had a lot of musicians that kind of divided
Oh.
in the band too. I mean, there was a lot of love in the musicians, and there was a lot of love for Jocko.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that I mean, Jocko. He was just a crazy person. And,
Yeah.
I mean, like, Jocko took his bass, threw it in a lake in Japan, and he did it so that the Japanese people would go diving for it and get it back. That's how the vanity he had. and he'd walk around the Bullet Train. I'm talking dark things, negative things about him. There's some, musically, he was a genius.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing that amazed me about Jaco is the only other person I ever saw could lose one like he could is Bob Brookmeyer, but he could lose one, and boy, he'd just know where one is all the time, you know. That's, Randy Brecker can too, you know, Michael, but not many players I know can really lose one and know exactly where it is.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean by that?
Yeah,
Right? Yeah.
in their own soloing,
yeah,
and,
right.
like, not be playing over the
With
bar line kind
one,
of.
yeah. And you know, we started out like we had this big party in Tokyo when we first got there, and Woody Herman was there with Flip Phillips and Al Cohn, and I don't know if Zoot was there, and it was like a all-star Woody Herman band or some pickup band, and Kay Whitting was there with J.J. Johnson. It was a big thing in Japan where we all came together at the end in Yokohama and put on this huge concert.
Mm-hmm.
But after this feast, it was a feast. I mean, we all went our separate ways on the road, so to speak, in Japan, and then we all met at the end of about a week's time in Yokohama and put on this big concert. So, sure enough, everybody's seated down. Everybody's like, it's very formal too, you know, speeches and everything else. And so Jaco comes in after everybody sat down. I think after he even started, he's like dressed in Indian war paint with a band around his head, you know. And Woody Herman said to me, you know, milling around the sushi and everything else after the speech, he says, "Wayne, who the hell is this guy you're with?" You know, I don't think Woody knew him, you know. I don't know if he knew of him from before with the weather report or not. I don't know, but he was adored as well. He should have been musically by the people in Japan. He could do no wrong, and I mean, he did outrageous things like riding on the windows of the Bullet Train in Magic Marker. I mean, you know, give me like.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like kid stuff, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And the last thing I want to say about Jaco, because I thought the world of him musically, and I thought the world of him personally too. He's a really deep down. He was a very nice, generous, giving person. As a matter of fact, and I was a nobody on the band compared to Randy Brecker and Faddis and those people.
Yeah.
And one night, just he and I hung out together.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't into this. He was like he wasn't into this thing like of just hanging out with his star soloists, you know, like Mincer and Randy Brecker and Faddis, et cetera, and other people. But anyways, one of the last times I saw Jaco, because I did do things when I came back to him, little things we did down the Village in New York with him, but the last sad time that I think I remember seeing him, I came up out of the subway at 42nd Street and 7th Avenue, and it was for a 10 o'clock session at this studio called Automated. It used to be a very busy studio in New York at 1500 Broadway, right there on the east side of Broadway. So I'm coming up, so I got to cross Broadway. Jaco's out there. This is hard to believe this, but this is a true story. He's out there with the records out of the jackets. I don't know if they were ever in the jackets, but with the plastic vinyl records, the LPs, like this. Mm-hmm. This is in rush hour traffic coming down. He's slinging them into traffic, bouncing them off cars. Who knows why? Maybe it was something he just needed. Did you ever read the book on it?
I have not read it
The
yet.
book is terrific. I can't remember who wrote the book, but the book is fascinating. Maybe it's just he just needed attention so badly. I don't know. He needs love or attention, but he needs something. So I took him. I took him up, he was dirty. He'd been up all night. You know, he was dirty. I said, well, come on over to the studio and see some of the guys. I said, Randy will probably be there or something like that, you know. So he went with me over to the studio, and I took him into the bathroom to get him cleaned up a bit at the sink there and everything else. So, you know, he looked terrible. So I took $20 out of my pocket and gave it to him. He took the $20 and started putting me down for giving him $20. He took the 20. He said, "What the hell do you think I am?" Or something.
Yeah, right.
But I could see he was down and out. I wanted, you know,
Yeah.
I wanted to do a little bit to help him. You know,
Right.
it wasn't $300; it was $20. But you know, so I remember he came out in the hall there for a while and said hello to a couple musicians. And then we had to go in and work. He just kind of disappeared and never saw him after that.
Yeah. Wow, fascinating. Sad. Let me wrap up here by asking if September 11th changed your life much, either from a music standpoint or in any other regards.
That's a hard one. I mean, I really don't think so. I mean, but maybe I should see my analyst to be sure. I'm only kidding. I mean, it was a terrible thing, an awful thing. As a matter of fact, I'll never forget the first phone call. The first phone call that I got that morning, and I had seen it on television. As a matter of fact, it may have been happening when I talked to, no, it had just happened when I talked to this, Al Porcino called me from Munich, Germany.
Oh,
You know the name Al Porcino?
Sure.
Yeah. He said, Wayne, and I don't know Al Porcino that well. He said, Wayne, what's going on over there? What in the world is this going on? We talked and talked and talked and talked and talked. I says, Al, I don't know, but I remember last night I subbed on Toshiko's band, and I remember seeing Jake Hanna at the bar, and I remember seeing Jake Hanna dumping martinis down, and I'm wondering what in the hell he's thinking about this morning. I never have spoken to Jake to find out
yeah.
with this hangover he must have had and this thing going, you
Yeah,
know, one thing
it's
is
like,
being
wow.
sober, but this thing going on. Anyways, but Al Porcino called me because what happened is that, as I say, we don't know one another that well. I mean, we know each other professionally, but he had recorded, I was over in Europe with Tom Harrell's octet, and he was in Munich the night we were there in this club, and he had his tape recorder running. And I remember that night, I felt good. I was on, you know.
Mm-hmm.
You know, some nights I didn't feel so good, you know. But that night I felt really good about my playing. So actually, I got his address from John Mosca, and I wrote to him in 1997 to ask him if he'd send me a copy of this tape. I never heard from him. Finally, in 2001, he sends me this tape. He says, "Oh, I just came across this on my desk." So I had received the tape, and I can't remember if I think I wrote him back to thank him for
Yeah.
sending me the tape, and he had just heard from me. So I was
needed to call
closest
somebody
one
and-
right after this happened. Yeah.
Yeah.
My son's mother's husband's daughter's husband, they haven't found him yet.
Yeah.
Now, my son wasn't really close to this guy, but he knows pretty well his wife, you know, because but that's the only close connection I have with anybody that was there, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And but as far as the music business goes, I don't think it's changed the music business. It certainly hasn't changed the music business for me. I mean, it was a big thing of cutting salaries on Broadway for a while, which I don't really want to get into, but I think our union was a little intimidated by the stagehand unions, who
Yeah.
always have a job.
Yeah.
Musicians don't always have a job.
Right.
And when Phantom of the Opera and Les Miserables, and I'm not there, so I shouldn't criticize, but I don't know. But when they're making millions and millions of dollars and not passing the profits down to the musicians, all of a sudden they start to lose money. They want musicians to be their partner.
Yeah, right.
You know, and it didn't last very long because business came back. And I think actually, I don't know the whole truth behind the thing, but I think maybe what money they withheld, the president of our union said,
Yeah.
we'll cut the salaries by 25%.
Mm.
You know, but anyway, I don't want to go there because I wasn't there, so I don't, you know, but,
Okay.
no, I don't really, to be totally honest about the thing, I'm really, occasionally I'll get, like I'm on Ricky Martin's She Bangs.
You're on what?
She Bangs by Ricky Martin.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I remember in the studio, I'm in the studio with this, we got this music phone that says She Bangs. And like I'm the oldest guy in the horn section of the thing, and I said, Jesus, when I was a kid, I said, I never heard that expression. I says, I remember the expression I heard when I was a kid was she gang bangs. And I couldn't believe that this thing was actually going to come out under
Yeah,
that title,
yeah,
you know?
right.
And all of a sudden, the record came out, and it's called She Bangs, right? And
Yeah.
that was the tune. And then, so I'm up at the beach in Rhode Island, and these little kids around me, and their father and everything else. I said, I did this Ricky Martin. You work with Ricky Martin? And he said, so I had to tell their father, like, yeah, it was. And then the thing becomes the biggest hit in the country.
Right.
I mean, it's like monster hit, you know. But She Bangs.
Well, this has really been fascinating talking to you.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah.
I appreciate it,
Yeah.
and best of luck with
I
your
hope I
writing.
didn't get too. I can get long-winded, you know.
That's all right.
I like to talk.
Best of luck with your new charts.
Oh, thank you.
And,
matter of fact, I've got the exposition. When I was in Rhode Island this past week, I wrote a whole exposition on a new piece.
Right.
I'm rehearsing in 2 weeks again. So I like to go in. I rehearse once a month. I like to go in at every rehearsal and have something new. If it's not finished, at least in progress, you know.
Yeah. All right.
Okay.
Look forward to it.
All right, thanks.